live chat. Glad to have you along. Just a couple of things quickly. If you want to stay connected and learn about our community, join us on Discord. Just go to remoteaf.ca, click the community button. It'd be fantastic to have you. Today, we have a fantastic cast and crew here to talk about, we said, a very polite debate about psychological safety, and I will be ensuring so. But I'll let them introduce themselves. Amy, it'd be great if you could or I should say Dr. Amy, it'd be great if you let everybody know who you are.
I'm Amy, and my background is that I'm a clinical psychologist, but now I run programs that are designed around high-performance teaming, which essentially is built on courageous conversations, courageous connections, and psychological safety.
Fantastic. And Chris?
So I don't really know how to describe myself particularly well. The last time I spoke to our friend Nigel, he said strategic organisational design and executive coaching, but I don't think that really covers everything. So a lot of what I look at tends to be decision-making, complexity, real agility, distributed working, and have a specialism in human learning, which I think ties a lot of it together. I'll probably stop there, I think.
Brilliant, brilliant. And that leaves us with our final guest, which is the CEO of RAF, Mr. John.
You just stole my intro.
I know, I did on purpose.
So I'm John Tooth, CEO of RAF, and according to Google, I just reached being a level 4 local guide because of my reviews, which is my most recent claim to fame.
Right, well, we'll go from there. All right, fantastic. So we are here to talk about this thing called psychological safety, and it is a debate. So let's just start with that. I'm interested to hear what your version of what psychological safety actually is before we really get into talking about what it should be and what it shouldn't be. So I might start with you, Amy, because ladies first.
Well, it is defined by lots of different people in lots of different ways, but the definition that I understand from probably was from Khan in 1990, which is really around being able to show and employ oneself without fear of negative consequences of self-image, status, or career. So that's the sort of standardized sort of concept of psychological safety, although it's a spectrum, obviously. And I think when a lot of people talk about psychological safety, they're actually talking about psychological damage or psychosocial risks. So right at the sort of toxic end of things, which it's definitely got the potential to be that. You know, if we don't feel safe, it could be that it's a damaging space. The way that I think about psychological safety in a high performance way, or a work context anyway, or collectively, it's about making sure that we understand how to make ourselves feel safe and understanding how we enable other people to feel safe enough to contribute their intelligence, essentially, so that we raise our cognitive diversity, raise our collective intelligence. And that happens when we're having conversations that allow for that to happen. And if we have low psychological safety, we can't have those kind of conversations. So we have poor collective intelligence. So I have a lens on it of high performance as opposed to the psychosocial risk end, although that's become more important for everybody to understand, particularly in Australia, because we have now major legislation that prevents organisations from allowing psychosocial risks to be present at work.
Brilliant. Chris, we might ask you to comment on that.
So I think that there's a lot of commonality with how I see it. I mean, I approach it from probably a slightly different, or I don't know if different is the correct word, a slightly parallel perspective, perhaps, in terms of the fact that I think that there are additional elements these days for the psychological safety aspect. So I really like the idea of that kind of collective cognition and that inclusion. Of course, inclusion and diversity is a big thing. As somebody who is neurodiverse, it's quite interesting for me personally, because I see how not being included. And of course, I can't remember which exact model this is, but you've got your idea of psychological safety having the 4 stages of, inclusion and learning and the ability to contribute, and then finally, hopefully, the ability to challenge. And I think that that's quite interesting, because psychological safety doesn't necessarily mean everyone being harmonious. You need to have that. And there's the complexity element of respectful dissent being required for proper collaborative production and collective and distributed cognition and all that kind of thing. But I also see psychological safety slightly differently, in that I link it into comfort zones, which is a massively overused phrase that I see happening on LinkedIn in various HR circles, and comfort zones. It quite interestingly, I think that there's some interesting psychosomatic or potentially kind of physiological mapping that you can do here. You need to have somewhere that you can actually feel that you can recover and recharge, especially depending on what kind of personality you are. And I'm not talking MBTI, I'm talking, whether you are autistic or you are very introverted, or people drain you or give you energy. And there are various, obviously, distributions of people like that in an organization. So having a space where you can feel safe and recharge, I think is really important. But then you get on to the idea of the required stimulus for optimal performance and learning, which isn't what most of the diagrams that you see on LinkedIn are, which are like, you've got to smash through the fear zone and all of this kind of stuff. So I think that there are some interesting aspects around that, kind of almost philosophically as well, which I like to explore.
Brilliant. And then I'm going to ask our painted naysayer for the day, John. John, would you like to give us what you think about psychological safety? Well, that will help us start the debate, I feel.
I can't really muster a better definition of psychological safety than what Amy and Chris have already shared. Like, I think if I was to try and give a layman's summarization of it, I interpret a lot of that as an individual being able to hold trust within their environment and their peers well enough to perform at an optimal level for their work. If I was to try and condense, I think where this produces something that can be interesting to have a productive debate around, though, is when you look at how organizations try to buy that in terms of what's represented in terms of their investment. And this is where I tend to be perceived as a bit of a naysayer. Like, I think it's something that's important. Like, people should feel safe at work. It's generally a good thing to be able to trust the people you work with. It's good to avoid things like the risks that Amy had mentioned earlier. But how that manifests in terms of what an organization does in terms of putting money to it often is a veneer or something that isn't going to actually penetrate and make a meaningful change. And that's where I take umbrage with the term and a lot of the work that gets bundled up and wrapped up with that term, because I think it actually does more to muddy the waters than to make any serious advancement for organizations.
But does it? So let me ask the question. Let me pick you up on that. Is the fact that organizations are even thinking about it, talking about it, and spending some money on it, is that not a good thing? And I saw Amy smile, so I'll give you right a reply, remembering that I'm just poking the bear's, so to speak here. Amy, what's your thoughts on that?
I think that it's become a very ubiquitous sort of, like what I would call like a nod thing. Like, everyone goes, yes, we must have psychological safety. And so there's a danger that people get told to be safe. You must be safe. You must make psychological safety for those that you lead. You're responsible. I think there is a danger in, any sort of cultural fad of the moment is that everybody says you must be safe. My belief is that you can't be told to be safe. That's not useful. I do feel that not everybody has learnt the skills to create safety for themselves, which comes, down to what I understand is a courage piece. I need to have courage to hold my boundaries tight, to speak my truth, to voice my opinion, to question authority, to bring up new ideas. Those are things that I can do there are things that I can learn to do that more. And I also believe that people can learn how to compassionately and vulnerably listen and be humble enough to invite other people's thoughts and perceptions. So I do believe that it's an individual process that people can be taught, as opposed to an organizational mandate that I don't believe in. So I think I agree with you, John. I do believe that people can learn the skills to create safety for themselves and others.
Thoughts, Chris?
I have a slightly different take. I mean, I completely agree with that, but coming from kind of more of a complexity background, I completely agree that the idea that you can install it by saying to people, well, you need to do this. I think that one of the mistakes that organizations habitually make is that we have this idea we must change the individuals. So I probably wouldn't even lay it on individuals per se. Generally, if you want these things to sustain, they grow in quite an entangled fashion because of the interactions between humans. So what organizations really should be looking at, from my experience, is changing the environment to allow psychological safety to grow and develop, rather than saying we are installing it and you all have to start doing it, because changing people is, number one, difficult, and number two, there are potential ethical thoughts around forcing people to change what they're doing. So we're already working hard at trying to help people within companies have some kind of human autonomy and stuff like that. So but it's kind of, I think it's linked to, but it's very much like the concept of empowerment in that respect, where a lot of leaders say, well, this sounds good, and we've got our HR department with a systems thinking approach, so you are all now empowered, which is a very interesting way of looking at it, because you're effectively loaning permission to people which could be withdrawn, which is not really necessarily a psychologically safe approach. So having that idea of enabling something to grow from the environment that's there, providing the environment for that to happen. If you have an environment where psychological safety is allowed and can happen, then it very often will, and you may need to nurture it. And you've got the whole complexity thing of a thicket of brambles is going to grow whether you like it or not. So actually the best thing to do is manage it into the shape that you want, rather than fighting the thing all the time. That's quite an interesting kind of approach. But absolutely, there's a huge amount. I completely agree with Amy and John. There's a huge amount of lip service and damaging misrepresentation, and over time that becomes monetized, and then you end up with these very hollow initiatives that people slap into place for a tick box, and it really muddies the waters. As John said, it's a real problem, I think. And you see the same with agility and all sorts of other things, or agile, capital A, if you want to be more specific.
Oh, please don't start with capital A and bottom. Let me take something you said there, though. So if I look at it in the context of that, isn't psychological safety, though, something that you can buy and sell and bring in? Isn't that why organisations have their HR departments? Don't they own culture? So therefore, that they can grow that within the organisation. Is that a bad thing, John?
Do they own culture?
I was going to say, interesting.
It's one of those things, right? Though, seriously, I think I want to try and depart some of my thinking around this to be beat up on HR, because HR does a certain function, and even within HR, you've got a gamut full of stuff that happens that isn't strictly on point for this topic. But that aside, it's one of those things that I'm kind of a bit hung up around. One of the things that Chris said, and actually kind of relates to a term from Amy's book, which I read just last week. And the thing that came up for me when I was reading your book, Amy, was around how social pain presents in the brain more or less in the same way that other pain does. Now, when you start thinking about that kind of muddied waters, lipstick on a pig, if I was to give it a vulgar term for psychological safety, I can't, if someone's physically injured, at least for their body, I can, put a Band-Aid on it. I can't inject trust into people. I can't inject a sense of safety. I can't inject boundaries. It would seem that, if you're going to invest in something, it's probably more rational to make available the resources for them to be able to develop those things themselves, and potentially look at some things environmentally speaking, like in terms of what kind of situation are we setting up for our people. You look at things like an open plan office that is largely set up in such a way that the leadership can have overseeing powers over everything that's going on. I'm not necessarily saying that it's a inherently unsafe environment. I haven't done the reading to have any opinion on that, but is that something that's going to contribute to? It's a question worth asking, and a question that becomes a bit more complicated once you start looking at sort of digital working and digital nomads and the like.
Thoughts, Amy? I saw you writing some notes there. So.
No, I am. I think yes. All of it needs thoughtfulness, and all of these things impact the climate of psychological safety. If we assume that it's sort of something that we walk into and contribute to. In terms of, we can't inject trust. We can learn how to invoke. Is that a word?
Yeah.
Trust. Invoke trust.
Evoke,
maybe. We can learn that our behavior influences the trust that we create. But trust is the difference between trust and psychological safety. Supposedly within the literature, is trust is an individual one-on-one thing, whereas psychological safety is this thing that we create together. And if I come back to this kind of idea of we are pretty much programmed to be threat-seeking, like that's really what our brain is designed to do, to seek threat and to respond in the way that we understand is, approach, avoid, run away, fight, those are very basic biologically driven things that happen for us. That's clear. And you stick us in a room together with multiple brains in one space, that fires off in these kind of like micro ways that range from everything from, these, like two dogs meeting in a park, heckles up or tails wagging. So very micro cues that people are giving off, maybe not even knowing, maybe not understanding how or why they're getting a sense from somebody, whether they're safe or not, ranging all the way, yes, to the fact that we have office blocks that you don't even have to be in the room and see where the management team are. As soon as you walk into a shiny building with really fancy atrium, and you know that there is a behavioral expectation that's different from if you walk into a pub. So these are cues that we pick up on from an environmental level, from a social level, really because we are primed to look for threat, that all influence this thing that we're trying to do together, which is have conversations that mean that we ultimately get more of what we want. So it's all up for grabs, and I think it's very complex, and I think there are many, many ways in which we can sort of alter either the environment or the conversations or our knowledge about how people work that would have an influence over us getting more of what we want.
Nice. So, Chris, what do you think about that? We've got a question I'll ask after this, because instead of me asking the questions, some of the people outside are asking the questions. So that's good as well.
Yeah. So again, I just was making some notes there. I think that there's some really interesting stuff around the fact that, I would also debate that HR own things like culture and organizational design and a bunch of other things. And HR departments have very good functions, by the way. There's certainly no hate. But the fact that organizations can function without them also tells you something. So, we'll park that and leave that there.
To my defense, people. Actually been said when I've been in an organisation, so I'm just
No, it's fine. I'm just giving you a prod back because I felt you needed it.
Continue.
I think that one of the things that's really interesting about this is that psychological safety is an extremely human concept. It's something that's individual to all of us, and it depends from the interactions between people in groups of people, right? Essentially. So I think it's very interesting. A typical organization will look at something that's complex and human and depends on interactions and say, right, so how do we make this tangible and have a department own it? I just think it's a really interesting kind of disconnect that we fall into a lot with organizations, where it is in fact part of the environment and the culture. And if you look at culture, nobody owns culture within an organization. If you want to go with, probably most of you have heard me drivel on about this before, but, culture may be driven by leadership. And I make a distinction of leadership from management in terms of the culture. It's a disruptive element that develops from the interactions between people and teams. So it kind of, disseminates from the bottom up, if you like, but it's defined by the actions and inactions of leadership a lot of the time. So you've got these dark constraints in an organization where people just don't do things a certain way because it just isn't done. And this evolves over time. And it's a really interesting fact that we then look at it and say, we're going to own that. We're going to put metrics on it and we're going to craft it in policy. And it's just not how a culture or things like psychological safety or anything kind of work at all. So I think that there's an interesting element there that got referred to, and I'm going to kind of call it out more explicitly. And I think, by the way, trust is both invoked and evoked, but that's I think it's John probably knew I was going to pick up on that at some point. But I think that there's also this element then that links in, which is again much more human in terms of authenticity. Because authenticity is something where you are properly representing who you are. And I don't think you can really have psychological safety fully present if everything is guarded and hidden and you are basically masking. And as somebody who's autistic, I'm very, very familiar with masking. It's quite hard to have that level of authenticity. And then that ties into vulnerability. So vulnerability, I think, is intrinsically linked to psychological safety. It's the ability to be vulnerable with people and know you're not going to be taken advantage of. And vulnerability is a very interesting thing because there's a lot of work with, obviously Brené Brown has done a lot of work and talks on it, but vulnerability is an interesting measure of intent if you use it correctly, where you can use it to test if someone's going to take advantage of you or not before you're fully vulnerable. So I think there are elements of psychological safety that kind of link in there as well. I'm not sure if I'm actually muddying the waters here in the debate or not by throwing random concepts in, but I think all of the stuff is quite interestingly linked, and it just goes to show that it's not something that can be owned by any department as a nice linear causal install into an organization.
So I might just grab this question up. So you'll all see that somebody agreed with you, Chris, and they like Kurt Lewin's behaviour.
Finally.
Any behavioural outcome by influencing the environment they're in. But the question that goes with that from them is, okay, question is, how can a leader do that? Now, all three of you have mentioned leaders in this question, right, in the last round of talk. So there seems to be a very big inference on leaders, taking that from Sandika as well. So thank you for asking that question, because it was in my armory to poke the question about leadership. It seems to be that leaders are asked to create this psychological safety or be responsible for ensuring psychological safety, And I'm going to ask John the first question on this, because John feels that psychological safety in teams and that kind of thing is just, it doesn't work. John.
Yeah, similar to HR, I also feel like, you know, there's an element in here around, you know, any business problem, you can ultimately just put it on a stick and whack a leader with it and say it's your fault. And that might not necessarily be unfair in a lot of circumstances, but I think if your genuine outcome that you're trying to achieve is, you know, you're trying to allow for some repair in a, you know, take a specific example, like allow for some repair in a team where there isn't a lot of psychological safety and that's causing productivity issues, or in an organization that's recently gone through a restructure, or, you know, there's probably multiple organizations right now that are doing those on multiple fronts as we speak. Like, that's a common thing that tends to occur, right? I think while you can do a lot to provide support to leaders, and I'd probably trust Amy's words more than mine around some of that in terms of helping leaders navigate some of their own behaviors and how they impact the teams that they're leading. I think it is insufficient to just say, you know, the leaders go on a coaching retreat and do a lot of deep work for themselves, and they will come back these magnificent, empathetic people who can lead all types of personalities in any context. You know, that one of the reasons why I tend to be a bit critical around a lot of the media and some literature around psych safety is, like, treating this stuff as a non-contextual silver bullet is the quickest way to make sure it doesn't work. So there's a lot more when you start looking at things like, okay, well, what support mechanisms can we provide for this group of people? You know, like, think about it in terms of verticals of a business. I wouldn't say that getting the leaders together from a call center is going to work, but there's probably some shared activities that you can do to help people navigate tensions from a vertical perspective. And I think that would largely be a lot more useful, especially if you're starting to do some of the things Chris mentioned around, like, exploring vulnerability.
Amy, thoughts?
I agree that there are no silver bullets, and that there is nothing that's really going to take somebody from one place where they're not adulting well to a place where they are adulting to an extreme success. I believe that that's true. I believe also that we can dial up skills and dial up awareness and dial up consciousness of practice, and iteratively change environments because of that. And I think that placing it all on the leaders is a mistake. I think, you know, I think it's everybody's responsibility. We all walk into a space and have the opportunity to increase or decrease psychological safety really quickly. So I think it's on all of us to understand the impact that we have, and to gain feedback on ourselves and how we contribute to psychological safety. And I do also believe that leaders have an additional responsibility that comes with their role to be aware and to assess and to enable psychological safety. And I think it goes all the way up. So I think the higher your level of responsibility within an organization, or maybe even your hierarchical position, the more responsibility you have to play on the concepts of vulnerability, listening, time, understanding how to create trust and significant conversations despite the obvious power differential. I think that's a skill that people can master, and that they have a responsibility to practice that. And in answer to sort of like, how do we do that? And I do think this is, you know, look, if everybody could be a really good person, we wouldn't need to be talking about this, right? We all have knowledge what we want to be showing up as in any conversation or any relationship or any point of work. I teach conscious communication, but I know that when I stand up in front of a room, everybody could stand up and tell me what good communication is. That's not the problem. The problem is when we're time poor, when we're stretched, when we are nervous about things, when we have our own life stuff going on, where it's confusing, where there's changes, where we're being asked to do something we don't feel comfortable with. That's when we drop down in terms of our capability to be at our best self. And I think it's okay that we have reminders and pauses to reflect on, how do I help people understand that I'm really fully engaged and present in this conversation? How do I show understanding? How do I be inclusive in settings? How do I be inclusive in decision making? How do I invite feedback? How do I sit in the discomfort of adulting in complex situations when my pride, my values, my purpose in life, my sense of self are all up for challenge in this space that we're trying to operate together as humans to humans? And I think a lot of the work that I see of relevance is reminding us of this need to recognize, have self-compassion, sit in a place where we can reflect on what it is that we're doing and whether that is in line with what it is that we want to be doing, and how complex it is to be doing all of that with a brain that is programmed to seek threat. So I think we can elevate, not necessarily get all the way there, but it's an iterative process of self-improvement and other improvement. And I do think leaders have this added weight of responsibility.
Chris, I can see you were writing notes again, so listening whilst we ruminate.
I was writing some notes. Yes. Yeah, I think, again, there's nothing that I disagree with at all there. I think an interesting question, I'll do my usual kind of go through the conversation like a meteor. I think part of that is going to depend exactly on how we're defining leaders in this context in the first place. And, that relates to what John was saying as well. I think it's interesting that we talk about people as leaders when that's not actually their job title. It's a role that's been assumed because of authority, where in fact a leader typically is defined by a number of things, but very often when we're talking about leadership qualities, we're talking about people who are showing us positive, beneficial influence on a system by example, which isn't necessarily just management, right? That can be pretty much any an organization. So realistically, when we're looking at this, the onus, one would hope the onus would actually be on every human within that system to be part of this, not just to say, well, it's up to the leaders to define psychological safety. That should be something that we all kind of have a look at. And exactly as Amy was saying, it's one of the things that we know about how people are operating is that under duress, default patterns emerge, and we operate on our first fit mental patterns, often with emotional triggers and all the messy human things that don't fit into these nice compartmentalized systems that we build within organizations, which speaks quite a lot to how we structure organizations, I think, in a lot of ways. So it's not so much about knowing what good is and being good, but the fact that we know we will fall back into certain patterns under duress. And we've been conditioned, quite frankly, especially in management, we've been conditioned to operate and expect and decide things in certain ways. Management, I make a clear distinction. I agree with Dave Snowden when he talks about the fact that leadership and management are intrinsically linked and you have to do both. But for the purposes of this, leadership and management are quite distinct. Management is something where you really are looking at systems and structures, and leadership is how you lead culture and people. They're two kind of different approaches to different things. And management themselves often are not psychologically safe. So if management aren't psychologically safe and they have too many decisions to make in too little time and they feel that they have to have all of the answers, how can you help other people become psychologically safe as a air quotes leader if you yourself are not, and you're probably not even consciously aware of that? So I think that there's a conditioning element to this, and a lot of that has grown out of kind of modern Taylorism, neoliberal practices, and over focus on short-term returns and people as components. And there's a whole ream of things there that where you've got the complex side and kind of a more complicated, ordered side that we think is how companies actually run, and it really isn't. It's a question that I often ask leadership when I'm doing coaching is, if we got rid of every single person in this organization now and replaced them with people who had the requisite skills, would the organization work? And after thought, nobody has ever said yes, because the organization is more than skills templates, right? It's mostly built out of the interactions between people and knowing how stuff gets done and knowing all of the little things that, people don't necessarily know. Anyone who's ever used expenses knows how systems that exist must be gamed, it's that aren't necessarily fit for purpose. So it's quite hard to establish something more human in this space, I think. And you get all of these additional kind of subcomponents or substrates of tribalism and identities that all bind into this as well. And we assume different identities as part of different tribes, and we, join different tribes depending on circumstance and whatever, because we're in a meta-complex world and all of that kind of stuff. So you've then got ways. So how do we break this down for leaders? Well, one of the best ways of kind of humanizing it that I've come across is David Marquet's intent-based leadership approach, which unlike many of the books that I've read and indeed possibly been involved in writing, has been proved in the real world quite dramatically in turn the ship around. And obviously he's got leadership as language and stuff like that. And that's where everyone is encouraged and led to be a leader and to encourage and lead everyone else. And you start developing this awareness of the ecosystem we're in, the people around us within that, how we're operating in teams or crews or whatever it is. You've got your radical transparency. You start having things like equity of voice. I think that psychological safety, we can distill it down into a tick box exercise, but I think exactly as John and Andy are saying, it is something that is quite human and entangled. And I think it's something that we just have to be aware of, and compassion and empathy do come into that, because they're awareness of other people rather than just awareness of ourselves. And if you look at how businesses operate a lot these days, or some businesses operate a lot, when you're reduced to just a component, you just turn up and get your work done, and it's about you, because that's, you're not engaged with other people, you're not engaged in your work. So I think that where leadership is needing to kind of step up to that, and I'm using that in a very loose term, management and leadership, I think that's where we need to kind of have leadership become. So I found the best results when I've helped leadership become psychologically safe themselves. Is probably, I could have just cut all of what I've just said out and said that, but I thought it was worth exploring. So when you've got leaders, everyone becoming a leader in that context, I guess you're looking at leaders. We talked about all the way up, leaders all the way down, hopefully less thick-skinned than turtles, maybe.
So there's a very, and I'm sure you can all see it in your chat, there's a very long one. I'll let you absorb that, and we'll have a conversation about that in a moment. I chose the three of you for this particular debate for a very particular reason. And the reasoning around that is because we all get called into organizations and are asked to help them create psychological safety. And as an agile coach, or I don't do that too much these days, but agile coaches have been trying to install or inspire or evoke or invoke psychological safety, right, in organizations. And I came to a conclusion many years ago that that's not really my part of the piece, because I'm not qualified for that. So that's why I chose the three of you, because the two gentlemen, we've been in the coaching space for a very long time doing that. Amy, you're a doctor of this kind of stuff, so I'm interested to understand your thoughts about that, and then we'll discuss the other one when you've had a chance to read that. Amy, what's your thoughts about that?
Look, I think it's easier in smaller groups to create psychological safety in smaller groups. I think it's complex as you step in the number of brains that are involved in creating this thing, this elusive thing that can change very quickly, is altered by many things. So little concentric circles is how I feel like it works well. I think it's around building the courage to speak up, to build the safe space for self, in order to sort of move around these spaces and not to be too sensitive to the environment and use the environment as the cue for what my behavior looks like. There's a level of self-safety that we have to have that means that we can step outside of the norm of culture and do the thing that needs to be done. So that's where it sort of slips into the cultural conversation, is how susceptible to adopting the tribe norms are we as an individual. So that's the self-safety stuff. And that's a pre-programmed thing that we've been taught since day dot, to respect our elders, or to speak when spoken to, or to listen to the most important person in the room. Those are things that we are taught right from the word go. So to change a lot of that is very difficult for individuals. For a group, I think the smaller the space, the more that they have shared collective goals, the more that the individuals in the room are able to do that self-safety piece, and the more that they are able to tune into what they are doing that contributes to other people's safety, then those are the three elements that I work on at a cultural level. So do we share collective goals? Do I care as much about our collective goals as I do about my individual ones? Can I manage myself so that I create safety for myself? And can I watch what's happening enough to be responsive to what I see to enable you to feel safe, and to a team effectively, by facilitating the psychological safety of each of the individuals in this space? Now, that happens best in small circles rather than big, enormous cultures. So I work personally from a team perspective, team by team by team. The issue is that you're then sort of, if you don't join all the teams and all the concentric circles, then you're just making really tight mini tribes. So it is complex. It does come down to flexibility and agility of behavioral set. And it comes down to this desire and humbleness to learn about the behavioral impact that we have on each other, and to commit to growing in our ability to interact with a wide number of people, and that it doesn't damage our sense of self or value or whatever when we come across people who don't listen to us or whatever, that we don't then go into a space of, oh my God, I'm not worthy of being listened to. So there's a huge amount of personal space, I think, to do really complex work, because psychological safety is not that we're all sitting around having a lovely time. It's psychological safety for the goal of courageous conversations and courageous behaviors. So it's not about everybody feeling safe and comfortable. It's about being comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is the whole point of us moving in a workspace. So how we get people to feel comfortable being uncomfortable when they've spent their lives not doing that is tricky from a social perspective. And I think, so small concentric circles, building them together, recognizing collective goals, sense of self, and how do I impact others? Because one last thing, I think that a lot of the time we don't know what we're doing that enables or prevents people from feeling safe in a space. And the best of us will have an impact on others and not know, because it's not about intention, it's about behavior.
Brilliant. Just thought I'd pop that one up there for you. Cultural bubbles, and they quite like it. So there you go. John, thoughts?
I kind of, particularly when Amy was talking about the concentric circles, and I took a moment to reflect on, what times when entering organizations have I done a lot to promote psychological safety, or where it feels like the needle is moved in that spectrum. And there's an element of, it's easy to tie this back to the part about leaders. It's easy to pick on them around this. And I agree that they have a heavier weighting, but there's also an element of, why can't it just be everyone's job? Because the only thing you need to do is to provide permission, or potentially in certain situations set an expectation that this is an environment where we want people to be curious about how they can support each other through discomfort. And the kind of specific use case for myself with that is, well, I was working with a satellite team of about 40, 50 people. And they had essentially been forgotten by that broader enterprise. Like, they were sort of out in the sticks relative to everyone else. They did provide some quite material and important value to the business, but because they weren't a part of, like, core functions or something that was watched and monitored closely, they were ordained not really a part of things, and constantly forgotten about as part of change programs. Like, it was really unfortunate and disjointed situation. And I was sent in to fix all that. Not in complete isolation, but I was the person they were talking to every day. So a lot of stuff ended up falling with me. There were tears, outbursts. It was very volatile, sort of 6 months of my life. But those kind of key aha moments, those always happened when I was simply just being with someone, so they had the ability to navigate an uncomfortable topic with their peers, and setting up the context and environment for them to do that. I think that is something that, like, I certainly wasn't an executive in the situation. I was given, like, by the virtue of me being there, I was given permission by an executive to do some of this work. But, that's all it was. Like, even just allowing that permission goes a really long way, and understanding that means some time is going to be spent on having some conversations that aren't necessarily like talking about how we'll achieve this month's OKR. Like, you're going to need to spend some time working through some of the uncertainties and discomforts people have.
Yeah. Chris, I'll ask you to add to that before I jump into a couple of the questions.
Sure. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of really rich stuff there, and it's interesting how not everyone agrees with Dunbar's number. If you're 5 people, you're 50 people, and you're 150 people, but there is an element to that that I have noticed from, because primarily I'm a teacher, and that's kind of where I came from. The idea that you can more effectively get information across to people in smaller groups is, it is true. The more people you have, the less effective learning is likely to be, the less equity of voice you have. Humans learn really well in groups and collaboratively, because other people ask the questions that you didn't know that you had, which is a very interesting kind of way we do that. And we're quite unique in terms of species in terms of how we approach that. And then you look at how we have learned to learn very badly. And when we're talking about this kind of helping people consciously understand psychological safety, that's a learning function. And we've taught ourselves to learn very badly, which sounds a bit like some kind of oxymoron, but that's what we've effectively done. And a lot of that came out of the Victorian era and pedagogy, and how we kind of approach things with someone as a point of authority. We don't focus on learning outcomes. We focus on metrics, and we focus on somebody in charge, and we focus on kind of the wrong things. And you can see that, obviously reflected in how organizations structure themselves as well. So having a reframe to say, look, what we're really talking about here is the fact that we live in a world full of uncertainty, and we have to be okay with that. And you can start moving into Stoic philosophy and saying, look, the only things you can control are your thoughts and your actions, and anything outside that has to be okay. You can influence it at best, blah, blah, blah. Having that, developing that comfort with uncertainty. You cannot force certainty in things that are complex. It just doesn't exist. So we have to become more comfortable with that uncertainty. And that's where we look at probably the fact that we tend to repress a lot of curiosity in organizations. One of the reasons I don't fit into traditional org structures very well, being autistic with ADHD, is I do not conform particularly well. And that's okay, that's good. That I'm the kind of outlier, maverick, heretic, whatever, where innovation comes from, where new ways of doing stuff come from, if I'm allowed to do it. So there's a lot around that kind of conformity and that expression of the unique individuality that everyone has, the unique skills and approaches that everyone has. So, and part of that is curiosity and being able to approach things and test things and experiment. And I can see, where someone was in one of the comments, I'm just going to jump into it quickly, talking about kind of a competitive spirit and so on. There's nothing wrong with having multiple experiments that are probably, hopefully, safe to fail, where you can test and amplify, some of the outcomes and so on. But what I want to do is get into kind of a more toxic, destructive domination of other people through goals, where you're not talking to each other, you're not communicating, there isn't any radical transparency, and you're not operating in small groups for the betterment of the larger system overall. You are, very tightly focused on something destructive rather than something progressive and collaborative. So I think that there's an awful lot to that, and I think that there's definitely an ecosystemic element to all of this. I had a really interesting thing recently with leadership in a large firm, where my entire intent was actually to establish psychological safety. So I went in there with a bit of a bait and switch, and I used one of Raf's canvases for building an operating model. And we weren't there to do that at all, but that's not what I said. It was actually being used to try and help them. And I don't like the word align particularly. I think align gets overused. Alignment, cooperation, these things can be coerced. The Nazis were pretty well aligned, and that wasn't a particularly good alignment. But collaborative alignment, having everyone involved and invested in the outcome, I think is where a lot of this kind of stuff happens, because you're part of the system. And they started the meeting off by saying, are we allowed to punch other people? Which kind of gives you an idea of how well they were cohering generally as a kind of group of leaders. And let's be honest, in terms of leadership is very rarely a team. It's usually a bunch of individuals who may happen to be heading in the same direction some of the time. So how do you then get that? How do you establish enough safety and equity in that group that people are starting to talk properly and to come out with unified messages? Because the rest of the organization is not going to know what's going on. And so we actually established a bit of humanity in the group, and we got to the point where people were debating things safely. So there was psychological safety. People could, they felt included in the group. They were able to learn from other people rather than just being shut off and only looking at their viewpoint. They were contributing viewpoints, and they were challenging each other respectfully. So you had that respectful dissent. So by the end of the day, we had people around a whiteboard who normally would have been trying to murder each other. And it was interesting watching that break down near the end of the day, because people's social batteries were pretty much exhausted. So they kind of started reverting to default behaviors, but it was a very interesting way of doing it. And it was a small group. You cannot do it with too many people, because you just won't have that richness of interaction. It needs to be that kind of localized interaction and equity of voice for this to develop. So that's been very much my experience as well.
Thanks, Chris. Look, we're getting very close to the end of our time, but there is a question, a very large question you saw that was posted there. Now, I think we've answered quite a bit, or we've talked about quite a bit of it, but the one part of it I'd like to pick out of there is the final bit. They've said they don't think the leaders can always fix those kind of issues, which we all agree with. I think you've all addressed that. But what piqued my interest, and thank you, LinkedIn user, because it doesn't particularly say who it is, but sometimes it's an ecosystem model design issue that would be better served by its own inspect and adapt layer, but too often are not as deliberately reviewed or improved. So I guess the thought there is it possible that the actual ecosystem design, or the design of the organisation, creates this issue? Amy, your thoughts on that?
I'll
nodding.
I'll defer to you guys, because you know more from a systems perspective, but I absolutely think that there are some hangovers from the command control days of hierarchical control that are setting us up for failure to create collaboration and permission to fail. So 100%, as you say, competing priorities that are designed as part of the way to actually instill fear and tribal thinking, into the design. It's so common and it's so pervasive and it's a massive problem. And you, even in the most beautiful spaces where there are very value-led people who have great self-management, if they're in systems that are designed deliberately to keep people away from working together, it's it's really sad and awful. And then you're putting the wrong people in these training, so I 100% agree with where I think John is coming from, that, we set people up to fail. And the same is in any sort of psychological support services as well. If you're fixing people and then sending them back to a broken system, I mean, fixing people and, them fixing themselves within an outside sort of space, and then they're going back into a broken system. You can't help but almost foster this sort of demoralizing, and then sort of people taking responsibility for having failed at fixing something which ultimately the system is gearing against them. So I think we do need to, which is why I said about the collective goals, that there has to be a reason for people to focus on psychological safety, because it takes effort, it takes energy, it takes commitment, and really, unless there's a reason for it, it's very difficult to get people to understand that their behavior matters. So collective goals are essential. And if a team, when I walk in to help a team or an organization, if they don't have those, then I know we're talking about a group of people behaving well together, as opposed to real working on psychological safety. So collective goals, absence of that, really, we're talking about people trying to be nice to each other. That's it.
John?
Yeah, I think when we talk about how people relate to their systems, right? And there was, I mentioned it in the sort of our little pre-chat, but there was a period where I was doing some amateur boxing. When I would step in for a match, I felt completely psychologically safe. I had concerns and sort of a lot of head talk around, will I win? Am I going to get a bit hurt? And things like that. But I actually felt safe from a social and psychological perspective. The reason is because it has an understandable system that I could objectively interpret. I had trust that the other people involved in that system, my coach, the other competitor, the referee, the other competitor's coach, like everyone that mattered also would have a reasonably similar interpretation of the system I'm working with. In organizations, I think the mileage tends to vary quite a great deal in terms of how people, like the meaning people make of the systems they're beholden to. And that generates an extraordinary amount of uncertainty. And it's one of those things where you want to be cautious about that tension, because sometimes attention in an organization is a very productive thing. But some tensions that you're creating are potentially not deliberate and are inhibiting you from creating any more than a fleeting element of psychological safety. Like, great, we've got a psychologically safe team until we need to ask for funding again. Or we've got a psychological safe team until there's a leadership change, and what that means is shifted in meaning for the organization. And I think that that's something where, if you want to have something lasting, you need to consider both in context of each other.
I'm glad you brought the boxing up, because as you'll all know, when I first posted this, there was a bit of a spell check tried to create this into a physiological issue. Then we would have been talking about your actual boxing prowess. Chris, I'm going to give you the final word on it because we've really run out of time. Your last thoughts.
Okay, sure. I won't go into any of the MMA stuff, but as you can tell, I have been repeatedly hit in the face before. So I think that there's, I'm just going to kind of add to what's been said there, really. I think there are a couple of things that are quite interesting there. So an ecosystemic approach for me is definitely key. And this is something that definitely needs to kind of grow and evolve. So we can adapt and we can accept in part within systems, but realistically, the idea that still persists that we as a person or as a leader or as a singular group of leaders or whatever can sit down and have all the information, which we can't and we don't, to design an ecosystem of people is it's misguided at best, I think, because these things, if you look at how companies actually work, nobody sits down and designs them. They are complex enough that they are emergent, and that's a very, very human thing. You don't sit down and design your child's life unless you have serious issues, and I can guarantee it still won't turn out how you wanted it to. You know, we have to allow these things to emerge over time. And so many of the issues that have been mentioned in you know, certainly in that comment, I've seen come from the fact that people think that you can design it and a single point of authority without all the information, because you get intermediation difficulties and, you know, cost of delay on decisions and stuff in organizations. You can't do that accurately, and that so things are already kind of drifting off as you start doing that. I mean, communication can help with that kind of thing, especially informal communication. And that's one of the big things we don't have. As you over-formalize communication, you start losing safety. As you dehumanize the interactions between people, of course, you're going to stop having as much, you know, kind of intrinsic safety in things, because you are just interacting with systems and processes that very often aren't fit for purpose. And you know that they're not. Right? They don't account for things heuristically. They're quite rigid, they're quite tight, they're robust, which means they can break rather than resilient and more human and all of that kind of stuff. So, and we then end up as a result of that measuring the wrong things, and then we try to pick one way to fix things rather than gently and safely running multiple probes, multiple experiments, safe to fail experiments, if you want to look at it in kind of complexity and Cynefin terms. Some of those things should be designed to fail, because that part of psychological safety for me is the ability to learn that there is no feedback, and we need to stop being frightened of the word failure. Catastrophic failure, sure, right? But you know, failure in general is a very valuable learning device. And I think the last kind of point on, especially on that comment, is that leaders can't necessarily fix these things. And, you know, we talked about a silver bullet, and by the way, that might be a great name for your next book, Amy. But they can nurture and enable, you know, the environment or substrate which will allow things to emerge. So leaders can help kind of manage serendipity, if you like, which emerges from that. But I don't think that there's any way that we could ever entrust. I wouldn't want it if somebody said to me, come and design my organization. You know, strategic organizational design in my title is literally the opposite of what I do. I try to create space and substrates for things to grow, and it's kind of almost like a scaffolding that allows architecture to grow and build itself and support its own weight. And I think that a lot of psychological safety needs to kind of be bound into that.
Fantastic. Look, this has been such an expansive topic, and we really could go on much longer, but we have reached the end of our time. So I just want to thank you all for being on at Talking Remote today, and thank you for everybody that's been watching and interacting with us. If you're watching this, please, as I said before, join us on our Remote AF community. Just go and click the button and join us there. We'd love to have you. Again, thank you everybody for being on at Talking Remote today.
Thanks so much.